Well, Senator John McCain earned a reputation on Capitol Hill as a lawmaker committed to working with members on both sides of the aisle. John Dickerson witnessed this commitment firsthand over the course of his more than 2 decades covering McCain's political career. He also covered the senator's 2 runs for presidency back in 2000 and 2008. The CBS This Morning co-anchor reflects on McCain's life and legacy.
Mr. McCain.
6 days after learning he had brain cancer last year, Senator John McCain bucked his party and cast the deciding vote to save Obamacare.
Stop listening to the bombastic loudmouths on the radio and television and the internet. To hell with them.
He often urged his colleagues to ignore extreme voices, even in the White House.
Some half-baked, spurious nationalism cooked up by people who would rather find scapegoats than solve problems.
The son and grandson of admirals John Sidney McCain graduated near the bottom of his class at the Naval Academy. In 1967, he was shot down over Vietnam, imprisoned and tortured at the notorious Hanoi Hilton, refusing early release and staying for nearly 6 years. He later worked to normalize relations with Vietnam. The war hero left the Navy in 1980, the day his father was buried, and found a new way to serve as an elected official.
I have no improper behavior involved in this.
After being singed for his role in the Keating 5 corruption scandal in the late 1980s, McCain pushed for reform of campaign finance laws.
We came to power to change Washington, and Washington changed us.
He built his 2000 presidential campaign around that issue and nearly knocked off the party establishment favorite, George W. Bush. In the 2008 campaign, McCain wanted to pick Democratic Senator Joe Lieberman as his running mate.
Governor Sarah Palin.
But instead picked Alaska Governor Sarah Palin. That decision to woo the party's diehards foreshadowed the ascendancy of President Donald Trump and the seemingly irresistible pull of the Republican Party fringe, which he memorably resisted in the final days of his 2008 campaign.
I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with.
For more on Senator McCain's legacy, we are joined by John Dickerson, who is on assignment in Mishawaka, Indiana. John, you covered Senator McCain's political career for more than 2 decades, including his 2 runs for the presidency. So I'm going to ask you a question I know you have asked others. What do you believe is his political legacy?
Well, I think the biggest part of John McCain's political legacy is that he fought his party when he thought it was the right thing to do. He was a Republican 90% of the time. This is not, while he is probably the liberals' favorite Republican because he sometimes worked with Democrats, he was a Republican, but he worked with the other side. He understood that while people had differences in politics, they didn't have difference in life. They were all humans. And so even in his losing causes, one particular piece of legislation to limit and restrict tobacco sales was a big disappointment. It went down. But even in his defeats, he maintained this idea of working with the other party, trying to find agreement because that was necessary to pass legislation, but also that it was kind of important to keep the structure of America from descending into chaos. And that is probably his biggest political legacy. And finally, I mean, obviously, as a war hero, he maintained a set of standards as a prisoner for 5.5 years. And in politics, tried to do the same. And unlike other politicians, when he fell from those standards, as he often did, he was the one to be self-critical. He was the one who knew his shortcomings and was always trying to get back on track when he'd fallen from his own standard. That's something a lot of people think is long gone from modern politics.
Yeah, certainly. He also was not camera shy at all. Refreshingly, he enjoyed, I think, a pretty good relationship with many members of the media, and he appeared on Face the Nation a record 112 times. What made him such a good guest?
He was a storyteller in Hanoi for 5.5 years. It was his job to entertain the troops with stories. He was a romantic, and so he loved good stories in movie and in books. And so he knew the power of narrative, and also he had a set of experiences that hooked up with a lot of the things that we talk about in politics: duty, patriotism, courage, character. And so when you have somebody on who can embody or refer personally to those qualities rather than speak about them in abstract terms, that always makes for a more compelling political conversation.
Right. Senator McCain will be eulogized by former Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, both of them friends and opponents at different times. What does that say about him?
Well, it says what his attempt to and his successful effort to normalize relations with Vietnam said, which is the country that held him captive, which is that he understood that while you can suffer bitter defeats, you have to move on. And that moving on means trying to create progress even with people who you felt very bitterly towards. And having covered those two campaigns, there were some absolutely acid moments in the way he thought about his opponents. But he understood that progress in America comes through working with the other side, and that his new duty after losing was to stay true to that idea of America. And that meant working with those victors, and ultimately he came to be friends with them.
John Dickerson, thank you so much for your memories.
Sure thing.